Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere, as well as the women and girls who love them. Your host, Erin Pizzey, was born in 1939 in China while her father was stationed there as a member of the British Foreign Office. In 1971, Erin opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men, and not just women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men's suffering. Nevertheless, it's a passion she continues to hold to this day.
For too many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior experienced in childhood is often carried forward into adult relationships. Violence is not a gender issue and never was. It's a generational issue. To my amazement, nobody ever wanted to hear why violent people treat each other the way they do. Instead, feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for the violence in our society. There is more than sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent, especially in their personal relationships. But for many years, men and boys have been held to ransom and have been made to live with the lie that they are responsible. The knowledge of the truth has too long been hidden, and this has failed to help women, men, or children. My hope is that the 21st century will see women and men standing shoulder to shoulder to actively take on those who would deny that violence is an issue for everybody. Domestic violence is not, and never has been, a gender issue.
On this show, we will be discussing difficult issues and brutal truths. But in truth, there is hope. And in hope, there is healing. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Saturday, May 24th, 2014 episode of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I, as usual, am Erin's co-host, Dean Esme, Operations Manager at A Voice for Men. It's a lovely early Saturday afternoon for me. How's things with you, Erin?
Raining, cold, I've had to put the heating on. A typical London afternoon.
Very good. Well, you've had a pretty good 2 weeks otherwise since we last spoke?
Yeah, pretty good.
Well, as you know, Erin, we have a guest I'm very excited to introduce with us today, the Honorable Ann Cools, a member of the Canadian Senate. Senator, are you with us this morning?
I am most certainly with you.
Well, thank you. Well, I guess it's actually afternoon, but since we have a worldwide audience, it's morning or evening. Depends somewhere.
It is early afternoon here, and a glorious afternoon it is.
Oh, lovely.
Are you in Ottawa at the moment, Senator?
I certainly am.
Excellent. So for those...
I tend to be here a lot.
I imagine you do, since it's the capital, and you probably spend a lot of time in Parliament. Is the Senate currently in session?
We are in session, and we sit next on Tuesday.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, for those who don't know, the senator, while she was born in Barbados, has been in Canada. When did you move to Canada, Senator?
1957.
1957. Ah.
That may be before you were born.
I have to admit it was before I was born. It was about 9 years before I was born. You make me feel like a young man. I appreciate that.
Good for you.
At 48, I don't get called a young man too often anymore. But And so the senator was involved in Canadian politics and quite a few other things. Eventually, Prime Minister, I believe it was Pierre Trudeau, elevated Ann Coules to the Senate in 1984. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the senator is currently the longest serving member of the Canadian Senate.
That is true.
I know in the American Senate they sometimes call that the Dean of the Senate. I don't know if they have a special title for that in the Canadian Senate, but
well, they use the term dean, but it isn't a formal designation.
All right, but we can call you the Dean of the Senate. So,
yeah.
As one dean to another. So, Senator, I'd be curious to know I know that you and Erin are good friends, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
How did the two of you meet? I would love for you both to tell me about that.
Well, Anne contacted me, didn't you, Anne?
I believe I did.
Yes, you did.
That Malcolm actually did the introduction.
Malcolm?
Yeah. Now, just to be old age, Malcolm, he did the massive amount of research, and he's one of the most forefront people that I knew in those days defending men, because he had an appalling situation where he lost his daughter, and he never really recovered from it. It was Malcolm George. Now you know about him, don't you, Dean?
That's definitely a name I've heard of. I believe he wound up being he was a professor, wasn't he?
That's right. Yes, at a university here, and a friend of Anne's.
Yes, he was a friend of mine, and he actually, I was in London, and he actually took me over.
That's right.
To meet.
You came to see me. Yeah.
And fed me tea and cake.
Mm. I just come back from Italy. Do you remember?
Had a pound cake in your cake tin. But the important thing is, though, we have known of each other and had known of each other for many years.
Mm.
And we had followed and tracked each other's work very closely.
If it's the Malcolm George I know, and I don't want to just talk only about him, but if it's the Malcolm George I know of, he's was with the Department of Physiology at Queen Mary and Westfield College in London.
That's right.
And
He just died about a year ago, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Right. I would have loved to have gotten him as a guest, but he wrote a fascinating paper.
Dean, I would have suggested him, but the only thing I want to tell you, Anne, and for those of you who are listening who know about his work, is that though he'd lost his daughter and wasn't allowed to see her for all those years, when he was dying, she came to his bedside. And apparently the smile on his face was remarkable. Friends were there. And so he died content that he saw his daughter finally.
And he was reunited.
Yeah.
That's incredible news. If anybody who's listening wants to learn at least a little about Malcolm George, go into Google and type the phrase "riding the donkey backwards." It's a really amazing paper that he wrote that is on the internet on men as the unacceptable victims of marital violence. Just an astonishing paper. I always recommend it. So anyway, so the two of you were somehow introduced by Malcolm George.
Yes.
Yes.
Senator Erin was telling me that, and I don't more. You had some involvement in the domestic violence issue before you had even met.
Yes, Erin's work had a profound impact, I think, on the whole world, and it certainly had that influence on me. In addition to that, the issue of violence and discord between intimate couples had always been a matter that touched me deeply and caused me to do a lot of thinking, and with constant reflection on why is it, how is it that human beings hurt each other in this way. So what happened, this was around 1974. Now, we're really showing our ages. But I pioneered in Toronto in respect of the issues, domestic violence. And I opened and ran, I think, the second shelter for domestic violence for women and children in the city of Toronto, if not in Canada. But in any event, as a pioneer, I would say that I broke a lot of ground, and I I would say I was the foremost leader in the country on this subject matter.
I am actually rather surprised, Senator, because, don't get me wrong, I did make a point of reading up on you on what was available on the Internet, and I have found nothing referencing the fact that you started a domestic violence shelter or refuge.
Well, you just have to go back farther back in your research.
Obviously I do. This is amazing.
Yeah.
What can we ask you what caused you? And you did this in Toronto in the early 70s, then, right?
This was in Toronto right through, and I've continued to be involved with that agency actually right up to 1990.
Really, that's amazing.
Yes.
What is the name of that, or what was the name of that?
It was called Women in Transition.
Women in Transition.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, since we are probing our past and exploring our retrospective and work from a long time ago, I organized in 1977 the first domestic violence conference in Canada. And at the time, it was the special guest speaker was Richard Gellies, who, as you know, worked with Dr. Strauss in New Hampshire. And the name of that conference at the time was something like Couples in Conflict. And it's quite a while ago. But it was held. It was sponsored with my agency, which was a United Way agency, with then an institute for education called the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, because one of the professors there, and I believe he might have been the head of the department at the time, but I don't remember that so clearly, that's a long time ago, was keenly interested in the formative childhood and formative years in children's lives. And he took an interest in this subject matter and co-sponsored that conference with me and my agency, and it was very well attended, and I shall never forget it. Lots of school teachers and educators attended. You see, and this was before the subject matter was taken over by radical feminists.
There's a tale all by itself that I bet you the two of you are going to have a great deal to talk about.
Listen to something I said with Erin Pizzey in an article or chapter I wrote in a book, and I have it here with me. And if I have never sent it to you, Erin, I keep intending to, and I will.
Thank you.
I say here, in the 1970s, Erin Pizzey broke new ground. She introduced to the world the notion that domestic violence was a social problem, needing the attention of policymakers, government, helping professionals, and academics. Having started the world's first shelter for women and children fleeing violent homes, she soon thereafter wrote the first popular book on domestic violence called Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear. Pizzey had great influence in Canada and in the United States of America. So I just wanted to say that, and that Erin, as a single individual, a single woman working in London, her influence and her ideas traveled far, traveled across the ocean, and took root here. And when I say ideas, I don't mean ideologies. I mean the notion that these are issues that we should all take a look at, because violence between intimates is undesirable behavior, and we should make an effort at all levels to end it or to rid relationships of it. And we all forget that human beings quite often have little insight into their own behaviors, and quite often conflict emerges, and many people simply do not have the capability to manage the conflict that they are able to generate. So this was where Erin's work touched me very deeply, in that her struggle was close to the whole fact of human consciousness and human beings examining their behaviors with an eye to correct it. All if for no other reason but for the future of the children.
Senator, what is the name of that book? What is the title of that book?
Erin's book?
Well, the one you were just quoting from that you said you wrote
Well,
from.
it's the book. This is some years ago, and I'm trying to remember who it was, but somebody in the UK was writing a book, and, I got a letter asking them for a chapter, and I totally forgot all about it, and then I got another letter later on, and I did. And I think the name of the book was called Domestic Violence, a Multi-Professional Approach for Healthcare Practitioners. And the editors were June Keeling and Tom Mason, two academics.
Well, we're going to have to look for that book.
But you should, because
June Keeling, and what was the other name?
Tom Mason.
Tom Mason.
And it was, the piece I have here says it was published by McGraw-Hill, Open University Press.
Well, I'm going to make a point of hunting that down so our audience can look for it as well.
It's just one chapter, and it's pretty dense chapter, as it is. And what a lot of people do not understand is in those years, many thought that what I was doing was revolutionary, and I thought I was responding to a perfectly normal human need to assist other human beings and to bring greater awareness to their own behaviors. In my work, I've encountered women who would beat their children until their anger was spent. In other words, a woman would be angry at a child for whatever reason, and she would just lash that child till she stopped feeling angry. And I remember very vividly one particular incident where I heard this little fellow screaming, a little boy. And I went, in those days I was a lot younger, I ran up the steps, maybe 5 steps some time. And when I walked into the room, she had a belt in her hand, and the buckle was hitting him. She was hitting him, and this little fellow was bending and trying with his hand to protect himself. And I remember she was in a frenzy. And I remember having to use enormous strength, and I am quite a large woman, to pull her off of him. And I kept saying, you must stop this, you must stop this. You're hurting this child, you're hurting him. And I don't want to sound dramatic, but for the next 2 weeks or so, that woman sought me out every day, asking me more and more about hurting that child. She had no idea the kind of hurt she was causing to that child.
That's amazing.
And nobody had ever challenged her before.
And I would think that such boys, although it's not a given, I would think that such boys are at higher risk of going on themselves to become violent people.
It may very well be. Sometimes those little guys can become very sensitive, and they don't have to replicate it. All these things are very, very complex. Although there is a type of motherly maternal abuse that, when overdone and goes too far, does produce psychopathy in behavior.
Well, I call it emotional and physical incest, usually.
Well, it is.
And people don't like to name it, but I'm afraid it's the cause of so much male violence.
There are huge problems that come, and somewhere there's I don't remember, you're making me think about things I haven't thought about for years, but many years ago, before I ever got to the Senate, the Senate had produced a report called The Child at Risk. And in those days, I read very carefully all the evidence before the committee on the notion. And the whole idea was, what are those social factors in a child's upbringing that contribute to later criminal behavior or to the destruction or the damage of the child? And I remember very vividly one particular witness. He was from the United States of America, but I remember that testimony where he talked about that hard, mean, nasty abuse from a mother was a big factor in psychopathic behavior and the creation of psychopathology.
So it's interesting. Sorry, Anne. Yeah. Okay, it's interesting because not very far away from the Senate was where my mother was born and raised. and she was brutalized by her stepmother and beat her and ill-treated her. And it was my mother, who is Canadian, who actually is probably the whole reason, because she physically was very cruel and violent towards me, that I ever understood when the first woman came into my refuge exactly what she was talking about. So, it's the roots of who I am come from just outside Ottawa.
Yes. And this is something that many people did not see, because if you will recall, in 1995, I didn't plan it. It happened. It was International Women's Day, and I was speaking to a group of female civil servants of the government. They always like to invite successful women to speak to the employees on that day. And somewhere unplanned in my remarks, I said something to the effect that if we want to know more about domestic violence, we have to look more seriously at the other side of the equations, and we must examine violence by their mothers against sons. I don't remember the exact words, because I said, because behind every abusing husband stands his abusing mother.
That's jolly brave of you, Anne.
Very brave thing to say. Probably went off like a bomb when you said it.
Well, listen, you can't believe what happened, but you cannot believe what happened. I could barely get back to my office, and my secretary, Candace, was waiting for me. What did you say? I said, what do you mean, what did I say? Wow, the phones are ringing. I said, oh, what did I say? Let's find out quickly. Anyway, the long and short of that was that that this story, my story, or the story of my statement, it was all referred to as Senator Cool's words, Senator Cool's statement, became the lead story across the country, every province, every city, every hamlet. But the amazing and wondrous thing about it was that the public agreed with me, and there were many hard radicals who were hoping that would be the end of my career, that I would be finished. And what happened was that public opinion lunged and lurched and said, she's right. I remember when I was a child, this happened. My mother did this. And the talk show programs, I remember I did every single talk show in the country. For 3 days, I just did interviews all day, 3 full days. And the radio programs, these talk show programs, were running their surveys. So they would put out surveys. Senator Cool said, quote, do you agree with her? Do you disagree? And I can tell you, all those polls, I sustained all of those polls. And there was another one which went, when you were growing up, did your mother ever abuse you? And they could not manage the amount of people who were calling in to talk about these problems. Because for the previous 10 years, at the heyday of I guess you call it radical gender feminism, every man is just a beast. Every woman is an angel. Every man is a devil. You remember those years? Bad.
Well, they're
years.
still here. They're still here.
Yeah, but in these years, you couldn't move. And I tell you, it was as though a dam had broken, and it was worth it. It was worth it. That was 1995, and there's a lot of stuff still written about that. Every national newspaper, the morning after those statements, every single national newspaper in every major city and all the small towns as well, the lead story was on my statements.
And is the woman who opened the first, so far as we know, the first domestic violence shelter or refuge in Canada, if not the first, then certainly one of the first.
It's the second. Is it one of the first? One of the first.
Certainly one of the first. You, I'm guessing, experienced the same thing as Erin, that a number of the women you were trying to help were actually violent and abusive themselves?
A lot, yes. The thing about it, and people like Dr. Dutton and others have said this, when many folks ventured in, and Dr. Strauss and his university pioneered in scholarship in the field. But when most people were going into this, the easily and readily available evidence was always male violence against women. But as soon as the serious probing begins and the scientists move and act by reports from both parties about their behaviors, it is very quickly revealed and made evident that women are violent too. And interestingly, there's been evidence in that way. All you have to do is to look at the literature on child abuse. We know that women exceed men in respect of abuse against children. But,
not that it should really matter, but I would guess that if we're not addressing it, then we're not addressing a big part of what the problem is. I mean, it shouldn't matter who's hitting who. Somebody's being hit, but... Yeah,
but I was talking about that 10-year period from about 1986 or something like that through about 1996, where men, we have no idea of how many men were wrongly charged and wrongly convicted in those days of abuse.
And jailed.
And wrongly convicted and imprisoned.
Yeah.
We have no idea. We have no way to measure the numbers.
We've just got a new law.
It was plentiful.
We've got a new law coming in here now, which is going to pass a 14-year sentence. And even though the law is gender neutral in terms of what it describes, it only ever describes women and children who will be innocent victims of those that will be jailed for 10 years. And there is no evidence required again. So it's very frightening. It isn't getting better.
It is very frightening because when we were when I was working on divorce, and you were in Canada then. This was in 1998.
Mm-hmm.
We had witnesses who actually came before the Committee on Divorce and argued that in the instances of domestic violence, two things. One, women's credibility should be the definitive and deciding factor. I thought I was mishearing them, so I questioned them, and they responded that women's credibility should be the grounds for findings, meaning if a woman says so, it is so.
This is now enshrined.
And I agree. And, like, for example, everywhere there's something called zero tolerance.
That's right.
What they call it? You call it zero tolerance.
Against violence.
Domestic violence zero tolerance policy.
Yeah.
Which means that if the police go into a home and a man is standing there and his nose is bleeding and she's there with her fist clenched, he gets charged.
Yeah.
He is charged.
So tell me,
it's a very worrisome thing.
Tell me more about your first meeting. I'd be curious about that. The two of
Here
you.
in England. Here in England, or when I went to Canada.
When was the first time you and Ann Cools were in a room together?
When she came and had her famous pound cake from my cake tin and cups of tea with Malcolm. And I had just come back from a very, very violent disputation with my then radical lesbian editor who had remained all my books. And Anne arrived just as because I'd been homeless for 3 months in London, and Anne arrived just as I'd been given this flat, our apartment, a bed sit if you like. Do you remember, Anne? You walked in and you were quite shocked.
Yes.
I'm going to do the annoying thing and explain to our audience. You just said your books had all been remaindered. That's a publishing term for taken out of print. But in any case, please continue.
But I remember you walking in and you looked around and you actually said you were quite shocked because you'd assumed that I would be quite comfortably off because I'd written all these books and they'd all been bestsellers, and and no, I
legendary.
Yeah.
Legendary.
There I was struggling. Anyway, you got the cake, and we became very fast
wonderful.
friends.
Did another time.
And this was in London?
Yeah.
This was in London.
This is here at my flat.
Right here at the flat, yes, right there.
And then the next thing that happened is Anne invited me to come to Canada and do a tour to visit as many of the men's groups as we could, because they were completely ignored and they were having they couldn't get any funding. There were no shelters for men. And you take it up from there, because it was,
they were losing their children.
That's right. And deprived of access to their children. So I came and we did an enormous amount of work, didn't we? We flew from Ottawa right up to Vancouver, didn't we?
Yeah. We took out about 3 spots. I know that we were in Vancouver.
Do you remember why? What happened in Vancouver?
Well, I'm trying to remember. Something did happen, though.
The police were crawling all over the place when we arrived.
That's right.
Do you remember? Because they'd had a warning from a radical lesbian group that they were going to bomb us.
Something like that.
It was. I remember very vividly.
Somewhere there's got to be some records of that somewhere. But I know at one point I called in the security guys from the Senate because I was concerned for my physical well-being. And whenever I went out to speak at meetings, the police were notified, and RCMP fellows used to show up, which is very interesting because many of them were in the same circumstances that I was talking about on the platform.
Yeah.
You see, and we have no idea, never mind men who were wrongfully convicted, we have no idea of the numbers of men who have committed suicide.
Well, I know one of the men committed suicide outside our refuge. I'll never forget that. I mean, I've always seen it as the highest, that when a man loses everything, his home, his family, and his children, and he has no hope, that is his one way out. And it wasn't that long ago. It was Silverman, wasn't it? Was it Eddie? Dean?
Earl Silverman, who was running the only domestic violence refuge for men in all of Canada, had to close up shop because he'd gone broke, could get no support, and he killed himself, saying he'd given up. He'd given up.
I'm trying to remember. Was that Earl?
Yeah,
Earl,
that's right.
Earl Silverman.
I've got a picture. I've got a picture of him with both of us at one of the conferences.
We tried very hard to open up a new shelter in his name, but unfortunately the person we trusted with that stole a bunch of money from us instead. So, but we're still doing our best to do something good with his. Well, again, it was a lesson learned, and we're going to do what we can to honor his memory anyway. So, go ahead, Senator.
I want to read you a statement from a judge on zero tolerance policy. And his name, the case was in 1998, Regina versus Gannon, an Alberta case. And Mr. Gannon is a defendant who had been charged with assaulting his wife by his wife. He was tried and acquitted of the charge. And it seems the facts are quite interesting. It turns out that he, when he was charged, told the charging individuals that it could not be true because he was elsewhere. He was somewhere else, and the people would pledge for him wherever he was. Now, this is what the judge says. Judge Fraser stated, and I'm quoting, "I am advised the alibi was formally disclosed to the Crown. It was also disclosed to the police officer immediately upon being told of the allegations. The officer chose not to investigate the alibi and instead just laid the charge. Apparently he didn't feel he had any responsibility to do so." Judge Fraser continues, quote, "I find the evidence of the complainant and her mother to be contradictory, confusing, contrary, conflicting, irreconcilable and quite frankly false. Then he spoke of the dangers of the zero-tolerance policy in domestic cases. He said, paragraph 21, I want to make two further comments because one is curious as to how a man could be falsely accused in these circumstances, right up to and including a trial. The reasons are quite clear to me and disturbing. First, the police apparently have a policy of zero tolerance in domestic assault cases. Any zero-tolerance policy is dangerous. It is especially dangerous when it is not properly applied. Now, that is one case from many cases that are out there, and that is one judge speaking. But, it's just a heart of darkness. The use of these allegations is a terrible, terrible heart of darkness.
And you see, one of the problems I found when we were working together, do you remember Donna LaFramboise?
Very well. I haven't seen her for a couple of years, but
well,
I loved her a lot.
And she covered everything we were doing, didn't she?
Yes, she did a lot. She was she did good investigation as a journalist.
Yeah, and she remember one of the things we were saying at the time is the problem with the shelters in Canada and actually elsewhere was that they were bunkers for ideology. And very many fragile women going into the shelters were encouraged to claim that they had been abused by their husbands. And it was called hoovering, that he'd come home from work and find that everything had gone and his children, and he had no right to know where they were. And then the second stage, if he didn't respond to the allegations properly and give her what she wanted, they used to call it the silver bullet, which is when he was then accused of molesting his children.
Yes, yes.
And she wrote about that.
Yes, they call that one judge. I have a judgment where one judge called it the weapon of choice.
That's right.
The weapon of choice.
Mm-hmm. And this is going on right the way across.
Called the silver bullet.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, this is fascinating. I looked up that case, the Regina versus v. Gannon. That was just 2007, so we're talking only a few years ago, really.
No, this is 2000. It was October 2000.
Okay.
The case I'm talking about. No. It's no, you're right. It's 1998 case. Sorry. No, I'm looking at the wrong date. 1998. It was a 1998 case. What did you just say? 1997?
Well, I found one with a similar title anyway. One of our readers just sent it to me. Said it's 2007, which would be only 7 years ago. But maybe that's a different case.
No, it could be a different case. I don't know. Or who knows? I'm citing you one case. I don't know. It could have been appealed. I don't know.
Well, what frightens me, Senator, is that I don't think anything's changed since that case.
Well, I think there has been some change from the mid-'80s through to the 90s. It was unreal. I remember not wanting to go to dinner parties because every dinner party I went to was dominated by man-wife, man-woman discussion. And I've always seen these problems quite differently because of my work. And quite often, I may never be invited back for dinner again.
Yeah.
because of my views. Because I cannot accept that, all vice is man's or men's and all virtue is women's. Neither do I accept that aggression and violence is a gendered characteristic. It's a human characteristic.
It's generational. I mean, that's something I've been saying for 40 years. It's a family issue, and that's why originally I changed the refuge's name to Chiswick Family Rescue, because in violent families, everybody is affected by the violence. The grandparents, the parents, the children, and it's the work that we have. What upsets me most, we have wasted 40-something years. Millions of dollars have been misspent and fraudulently spent when the issue was never patriarchy. It was always a family issue and a human issue. And it still is. It still is. Oh, it is. And the only way children are ever going to have a choice out of a violent family, My mother and father chose each other. We had no choice. We were just born into their war, and it destroyed our childhoods.
And if you look at those things, those issues, there's a lot of heartbreak because some of these people just do not know how to have other responses.
Well, if you just learn that violence is the answer, a quick answer as a solution, and that's what adults do, you don't have any strategies except violence, do you?
And they don't know other responses.
Well, no, but that's the whole point of the refuges, is to teach other responses. I used to call them other strategies for survival.
Yes. But it's a very heartbreaking thing.
Senator, we're having a little trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I said it's a very heartbreaking thing. But I tell you, when you have success stories, they're really uplifting.
Yeah, because I have on my Facebook, a lot of the children find me on Facebook, and they're now in their 40s, and they've got children and some of the grandchildren, and it's so heartening. And I remember I was going to LA where my family is, and I got this email from a woman in LA who was enormously successful, and she said, I was a little girl in your refuge with my sister. Oh, no. And I met her when I was in LA. Gave her a great big hug.
But listen, just about a couple of years ago, I was at an event in Toronto, and I had to speak at the event. Actually, it was a police event some years back, 2 years back now. And so there arrived there a policeman who was a retired policeman who said hello to me and said that he came to the event just to hear me speak. But the interesting thing is that he said that the night that he heard me speak, he made notes on my speech. And he told me he looked up his notes. But the really beautiful and wonderful thing that he told me was that he and his wife were so taken by my speech that they went home and had a very deep, deep conversation about their relationship. Isn't that nice?
That's wonderful. Yes.
Beautiful conversation.
Yeah.
And promise each other that they would find better ways to resolve difference and conflict.
That's fantastic, isn't it? It's very warming.
It's a fantastic thing when people begin to understand that there is another response other than anger.
Yeah.
Anger is not the only response. There are many people for whom anger is the emotion they most easily express.
Yes. It's their default emotion, isn't it? It's interesting because so many violent people can't go. They can't because they've been so damaged by what's happened. They can't go from, so this hurts me, I can cry, I can let people see I'm vulnerable. The default is rage, and then in most cases it's explosion, and it isn't until they've exploded that they get that cathartic moment when they feel calm again. That's the teaching. That's what should be going on in refuges, not politicizing vulnerable people, which is what's going on now.
Well, that is the real heartbreak of many of those places, that the people, the women who come there are very vulnerable.
Yes.
And damaged, and I'll be quite frankly hurt, and can make no sense, and they cannot understand why. And they really need a lot of help with for somebody to sit down with them and to help them sort out the difference between their own feelings and the other person's feelings. And I'm sure you know this, Erin, but my shelter used to sit down with men and women.
Yes, we did too.
And help them sort things out. The others did not, but I always did that. Plus, on occasions, if I had a man, we never ever lied to those men if they discovered their wives were there. You know, we would sit down. We always made ourselves available to talk to them.
Yeah, we did too.
And I have many wonderful experiences with many men that I learned. I taught them. They learned from me, and I taught them how to open up their inner person and to discover that they can make other responses.
Yeah.
Dean, I do not know how much you know about this, but it's the most amazing thing to sit between two people who can press each other's heart buttons in a split second.
Yeah.
I really do not know how to set that aside and to reach for that soft, humane, gentle moment and to cling to it.
Well, for many people, they have no history of soft, humane, gentle moments. So you've got to start with, before you can even get anywhere, you need to have them in a safe place so that, and then they experience the soft, gentle moments being with men and women who are soft and gentle.
Yes.
I may have to ask you to speak up a little bit again, Senator, because we're still having trouble. I do have a question.
You're having trouble hearing me. It could be this telephone, you know. Are you having difficulty hearing me?
A little bit. I'm hearing you better now.
Okay.
So I did want to ask you one quick thing. I know it's a diversion on the issue of anger. On earlier episodes of this show, we've explored the fact that people, men in particular, but people do need to go through a period of anger sometimes, and that the real challenge isn't that they're angry, but that rather they need constructive ways to express their anger so they can move on. Would you agree that that's fair?
Anger has many different roots, you know. Some people can develop anger because they were treated unjustly. Other people can develop anger because it's the only response that has ever got a reaction from other people. You see, it all depends. But what happens in these cases, that men are deemed to be the ones who need anger management. Many domestic violence cases, there's so-called anger management for men. For example, I know of a young woman whose husband was being sent, or her mate was being sent for anger management, and she would say, "But I'm the one who started the fight." She would admit she had started the fight. She said, "We were fighting. He was not beating me. We were fighting." And she would be counseled, "Oh no, women can't fight. You really weren't fighting. You think you were fighting because he has told you, and they have said that you were fighting, but you are not fighting." And this woman came to see me about all of this sort of thing. And I'm just trying to show you, when one is looking at an ideological position which is not founded in reality, but it's founded in some concept in somebody's head somewhere, like the patriarchy, it is very difficult to bring real human circumstances to that.
Well, let me ask you about that.
That is one of the largest problems, you know.
Let me ask you about that. You said it earlier, and I know this is something Erin's talked about. Erin believes, and I think you said, the radical feminist movement hijacked the domestic violence movement. Is that your feeling of what has happened?
What I was trying to say to you is that ideology is not a good ground on which to found human relations. All of that is ideology. These isms are all ideology. You see? I am saying that when you set out to work with people, you should set ideology aside. Let us come to the patriarchy. And okay, I've got something here for you. Patriarchy. And around in 1990, the government of Canada sponsored a multi-million-dollar project called the Canadian Panel on Violence Against Women. Its report was named Changing the Landscape, Ending Violence, Achieving Equality. But when you start to read this thing, you find that even the titles and the subtitles were steeped in radical feminist terminology. For example, looking through a feminist lens. A section was called Patriarchy and Violence. You know, another one, and one of these statements was, patriarchy is not just a central concept in feminist analysis. For many women, it is also a daily reality. The most violent, profound expression of patriarchal power sits at their dinner tables every evening and sleeps in their beds at night.
And where was this published?
This is at page, I was just reading from page 17. The report was called Changing the Landscape, Ending Violence and Achieving Equality.
And this was put up for the Canadian government?
Yes, a federal report.
Oh, my God.
You see, as soon as anybody brings those kinds of, I wouldn't say analytical systems to human problems and to human beings who may not have enough insight into why they're into those behaviors, it will not work, and it cannot work, because ideology tends to ignore basic human facts and human needs.
I'm just astounded that well, I guess I can't say astounded, but that this patriarchy concept, which I take it you would agree is a nonsensical concept.
But I do not know, as worse than that, I do not even know what it is. I do not know what they mean when they say patriarchy.
Can I just go back to some history, Anne?
Yeah.
You know, when the first meetings of radical feminists happened in Washington,
Right.
and a lot of people were there that I know of, people like Susan Brownmiller, who's come to stay with me, and she wrote all the books on rape, if you remember.
Yes.
Now, the important thing at that point was when they decided to turn on the men of the left, because they wanted their own movement. And that's the moment when, instead of both men and women fighting against capitalism, the women decided to get rid of capitalism and to create patriarchy as the enemy. Wow. So that meant all men, and it excluded men from this brand new, shiny women's movement that we were all going to be brainwashed, like in a Marxist fashion. Because if you remember, we were all supposed to meet in our houses and invite our friends, and then they would help us to raise our consciousness, which was that we were not happily married. Marriage was a very dangerous place for women and children, and men, being part of the patriarchy, were oppressing us. And that is the early history. This has never been a rational movement. It's been a highly irrational movement.
And the thing is, even the term is a fictitious construct.
I know.
You know, they could have been called anything.
Yeah.
You know.
But it worked.
I like to joke and say that patriarchy means the devil. The way they write it and use it, they might as well just be saying the devil.
Well, but it was, and that's why I used some of that language. I said, you know, all good came from women, and all evil came from men. So it must be the devil.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about, you know, in itself is a tragedy.
It is. It is. It's decimated.
Tragedy.
It's decimated.
And that this decimated human beings, decimated organizations, you know, destroyed social agencies. And
the judiciary particularly.
Oh.
Those secret family courts are corrupt. I've had to deal with them for years.
But it was destructive.
And is destructive, and it's getting more destructive because it's going global now. The Violence Against Women Act, Hillary Clinton is announcing, will go global, and more money will be poured in as other women across the world will be given the benefits of radical feminism.
I find the whole thing disturbing, and I've seen too much, and listened too much, and read too much to follow anything like that, which is neither logical, nor sensible, nor sane, or even rational.
Or humane.
More
You know,
humane.
but it is a tragedy.
I know.
The relations between, close relations, intimate relations between people are very delicate and vulnerable areas. So the last thing you want to do is to move ideology into those relationships, because it's explosive and divisive.
And it hurts
You
the
know,
children.
those
Ultimately.
children, I mean, I still have lots of memories of children. I remember one little fellow, and his mom was with us. I think there were 3 children, and she was trying to find a place to live for them, and so on and so forth. And of course, our agency was helping in every way that we could. And I'll never forget, he was a lovely fellow. I really liked this little fellow. And he was a nice guy and very protective of his mom. And he was the eldest, so he was about 10, I think, maybe, a little guy. Anyway, I remember he went to his mother, and he came to me with his mother. And he was trying to persuade his mother that they didn't have to move, that they would be happy to stay there, and that I was very nice, and I would let them stay there forever. But he didn't want them going back to the home that they had come from. These are serious thoughts
For a child.
10-year-old child. You know, like some people, like Erin, you have that sensitivity and that very highly developed awareness and ability to perceive human behavior and human need. But that's a telling thing for a child of that age, to have those thoughts.
Yes.
I'll tell you, I've met a number of men who grew up in that era and have grown up since then, who have internalized this whole idea that all evil comes from men and all good comes from women. And that's a terrible thing to internalize as a young man, wouldn't you think?
Well, it's a horrible thing. You know, we're talking about the same men that would go down to the coal mines. You know, some of those men never saw the light of day. Crack of dawn, they went down to work in the collieries. You use that word in England, the collieries?
Yes, collieries, yeah, we do.
You know, the crack of dawn, they went down. They came up late at night. And on Friday nights, I'm told, you know, they would hand over the little brown envelopes. I'm talking about the coal miners in Canada. The little brown envelopes with whatever it was, $5 a week. And then they would put up their hand for a quarter to go to the tavern or the pub to have a couple of beers. Many of those men rarely saw the daylight. And many of those men lived, as the whole community did, all the houses around, with their lives governed by a whistle. There was a whistle that blew to come to work. There was a whistle that blew when it was time to go home, at the end of shifts, I mean. And there was a whistle, I'm talking about a certain place in Nova Scotia, there was a whistle that meant danger. Something had happened at the mine. And I've heard endless stories of when that whistle would go off, everybody would rush from the houses to run to the mines to find out what had happened. So when we talk about men, these are the same men that were working to the best of the abilities that they had in the social conditions that they grew up in, and every penny that they made went to those wives and children. And men have done that for years. Men have gone to sea, gone away, and being at sea 100 years ago, 80 years ago was no big pleasure. Maybe it is today, but on cruises and so on. But I'm talking about men who were going to sea to earn money for their families. And this goes on. All of this dangerous work. You go to the forests of Canada, the men who are bringing down those trees, taking those trees down, they're working hard, dangerous work. And nobody has ever thought about how many men, for example, on those ships trying to repair the mast would fall and be killed. Apparently, every night in those old ships, they used to record the number of men who were killed falling off the mast. So how can it be that men who have given their lives, most of them, and every penny they have ever earned to their wives and children. How can suddenly overnight these guys become the men from hell? Or the people from hell?
Because it was a point in the history which will actually probably come down the generations and resound against the women of the 60s and 70s. It was a point where women, and Betty Friedan said this, I heard her recount when she was at the American Embassy in London, and she stood there on the stage and she said, the problem with the women's movement is that we reached out for male power and economic equality. What we didn't realize is we should have been looking at relationships between men and women. And I think that's exactly right.
That's good.
She apologized. She apologized for what she'd done. And I just remember standing there looking at her and thinking, yeah, I know this is all very well, but look at what you've done to women and to children and to relationships and men over the years, because she was, as you know, she was a Stalinist originally.
So she had a communist background.
Yeah.
She did.
But then
what's astounding too, Erin, is that you are the only source I've managed to find anywhere that actually says that she recanted that way.
Dean,
I'm not calling you a liar. I'm just saying it's interesting that this has been...
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, you see, you're right. This is the history. You couldn't find Anne's involvement with the shelter movement. If you look at the websites in England of the refuge that I ran for all those years on their website, I'm not there. The National Federation, who run all the other refuges, on their website, I'm not there. I've been erased. That's why our program, Dean, is so enormously important, because it's a historical record. Yeah, you were.
I was erased from mine as well.
Really, the shelter that you set up, they don't mention you anymore.
Well, they've closed. They continue to have so much internal conflict between the different kinds of feminism that eventually it closed. But it is as though I was never born to some of them.
Well, of course not, because you don't accept feminist ideology. And I'm going to assume, that because you don't accept this ideology, this does not mean you think women should be subordinate to their men.
Absolutely not. Absolutely.
Oh no, I mean, Anne's whole life, Anne's whole life is that of a standalone woman. I mean, she doesn't identify herself at all through relationships with men, but she's always been, and both of us are, great admirers of men, as she's just said.
Always. And I've done as much work to help men as I have to help women.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's the family, isn't it? It is
the family.
Mm.
You know, it is that, human nature and God have assigned this business of procreation to men and women.
And to love and be loved. And this is, when you get an ideology of hatred, which is what this is we're talking about, that nothing good can come out of it except concentration camps and gulags.
And everything is looking at life through these lens. Why don't we just look at life as it is?
Because the women who have the platform and are now in positions of great power, and I can name them in my country, we've got Harriet Harman, Patricia Hewitt, and a whole raft of them, and you probably can name the same women in Canada who actually perpetrate this, because they have got an enormously lucrative ideology that cuts men out, so there's no competition, and the way it's going, as particularly, I don't know so much about Canadian campuses, I know about English campuses and American ones, men are slowly actually leaving.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's very fascinating in a way, because I'm just I have to go back and reread some of this, because I'm being reminded of a lot of this, because there's something in human beings that if they have pain or distress that makes them vulnerable or easy to be manipulated by giving them an explanation. One simple little explanation that will explain everything very simply. So, and I've seen that happen to many women in and around the shelters, where somebody says, all of this is the reason why your husband is this way. It's all of this stuff. And all of a sudden, that adds now a new conflict, an additional conflict to an already conflicted situation. Do you understand what I mean?
I do, and I also think, Anne, if when you look at the histories of people like Germaine Greer, Gloria Steinem, who I knew, and various others of the leaders, one thing that they all have is conflicted family relationships. And in many cases, it's fathers who've abandoned their children. Right. And for that reason, they all men, as you know, the mantra, that make the personal political, which means that if your father was violent, then all men are violent. And it's, as you say, it's a very easy mantra to actually brainwash vulnerable people.
Many people accept it quickly, and then they go down that road. And it's a very sad and terrible thing. And you see, I've sat with so many men in those circumstances, and somebody is, describing this guy to me as a man from hell, and I sit down, I talk with this fellow, and I see a fellow who's barely coping, who doesn't even understand what he's feeling.
Yeah.
Or who doesn't know what to do with it, and nobody will help him to unravel all of those feelings.
Well, that's why, like you, we always have.
Oh, yeah. And I've done a lot of, as a matter of fact, I must show you this letter. I must remember to bring it for you. I think it was about 10 years ago. There was a man that it was a bad situation that couple were in, and I helped sort it out. I sorted out the situation. Anyway, I heard that he'd done quite well, and he'd gone to school, and he'd studied, and then he was a university professor somewhere. Anyway, so the person who was telling us, I spoke to him, and I was just so pleased that he had done well. And he told me that he has always known that without my intervention in his instance, he was going to a bad place. Something bad was going to happen. And I said to him, I knew that too. I don't know what it was, but I knew that you were on a road going to a bad place. And that is a staggering and a wonderful human admission to make.
Yes, it is indeed.
And this is where, so that you understand, Dean, this is where I come from. I have spent a fair amount of time defending my point of views. And I have always moved from a position of assisting and working with people. It's never, I met a young fellow, younger than I am, who's a judge now. But I met him about a year ago. He said to me, I've been hearing your name all my life. So that's how a younger person, a man who's, say, 20, 25 years younger than I will see life. And he said to me, he says, and everything you've ever worked on, he says, is always justice for somebody. And I felt very honored that he would say that about me, because I was raised in that sense that you owe a civic duty to the rest of society to make humanity better, to make the world a better place, to improve their lives, especially people who don't seem to be able to do it on their own. But at the same time, I was raised to have some convictions and to believe, to have some beliefs and to hang on to them in the face of adversity and in the face of those who will oppose your beliefs. So I have had to work hard to sustain myself and to maintain a relationship with God, to be able to live what I would describe as an authentic life. It is very easy to be what other people want you to be. And this is how I am, and this is how I have lived, and these are some of the reasons that Mr. Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, chose me to serve in the Senate. So and I do it all the time, if I am the last person on the Senate or the only person to vote no, because I think what is before us is wrong, I will vote no, and it's okay if I'm the only one.
Amazing. Speaking of taking a public stance, in and Toronto for that matter, on June 6th and 7th, which is a Friday and Saturday, there is going to be a domestic violence symposium in Toronto. I believe it's located at 5 Kings College Road. There was a brief period there when the people running it thought they might have to reschedule it, but we got confirmed news last night that that is not going to happen. The Toronto Domestic Violence Symposium for 2014 will be happening on Friday, June 6th and Saturday, June 7th. And Senator, I believe you're going to be there, aren't you?
Yes, I'm planning to be there.
I can't wait. This is actually historic. We're not going to let people forget that Ann Cool started one of the first domestic violence shelters in Toronto. That's a bit of information that we need to make sure everybody there knows. And I know they did mention that they're dropping the ticket prices to only $40, which is quite impressive. Anybody who's interested in that should go to torontodv.com. That's Toronto, D as in domestic, V as in violence.com. And rumor has it, Erin Pizzey will be there too.
I definitely will be there because I was a child in Toronto and I'm half Canadian. So it's like going home for me.
And there's also going to be Professor Martin Fiebert has already confirmed he'll be there. Professor Miles Groth, Vernon Beck, Walter Fox, Stefan Molyneux, Loris Harenda, who is apparently associated with the women's shelters in the Toronto area. It's going to be quite an event, and if you can make it, I hope you can, everybody who's listening. Do either of you know yet what exactly you'll be talking about while you're there?
I'm going to be talking about a different therapeutic approach to all victims of domestic violence.
Didn't you tell me, Erin, that you recently gave a presentation in Portugal on the
same
topic?
It was a Skype presentation, and the two other speakers both gave the standard radical feminist line. I actually said I'm here to say that the original model for the refuge shelter movement was that of a therapeutic community devoted to the care and understanding of all victims of domestic violence. And it's interesting because I don't think the audience, and I think that they said that, had never been presented with this kind of evidence about the needs of victims of domestic violence. And I explained that for so many families, children particularly, the rest of their lives, many of them will suffer from post-stress. And people would think in a war they understand completely, but when children, certainly myself, my twin sister and my brother, suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder because what happened in our families were in many cases worse than many of the discussions in war and the things that happen in war. And so what I want to be talking about is the true victims of domestic violence, the children, because they don't have a choice.
No, they don't have a choice at all.
And also, if anybody is of interest, in the city of Detroit, Michigan, which is right across the border from Windsor, Ontario, on June 26th through 28th, Erin Pizzey and Senator Cools will both be at the International Conference on Men's Issues in Detroit. So that's June 26th through 28th. I will mention that also appearing there will be Dr. Warren Farrell, Robert Franklin, Barbara Kay, who's well known from Canada's National Post, Professor Miles Groth, Carnell Smith, Dr. Paul Nathanson, Stefan Molyneux. Quite a few other notable luminaries will be there, not just to talk about domestic violence and men, although that will be one of the issues, but also a whole host of range that are affecting men, particularly young men these days. The education system, the legal system, the family court system, mental health issues, and many things like that. I'm looking forward to meeting both of you at that event. We are getting near the end of our show time. Is there anything else you...
Hello?
Oh, we seem to have lost Dean.
Oh dear.
Yeah, we've lost his audio.
Oh.
So shall we wrap up the show then, do you think, James?
Well, that's entirely up to you. I mean, if you and Senator Cools want to talk a little bit more, that's just fine.
Well, you know what, Anne? I think you and I will be talking as soon as we see each other
I
in
think so,
Toronto.
for a long time.
And it's lovely. It's absolutely lovely to be able to know that I'll be seeing you.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it enormously.
God bless you, and I'm so glad to know you.
Always. I feel very good about our friendship.
I do
It
too.
means a lot to me.
And to me. Now,
Thank
James, I think that we haven't got Dean back, so on behalf of the show and everybody who's involved, and particular thanks to you, because you're our wizard, I think we could say goodbye to everybody, and in my case, it's good night.
So I would say good afternoon.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Hello, I am back.
Thank you.
Hello, I am back.
Oh, Dean, well. Okay,
I'm so sorry.
We've just gone. We've just.
Oh, you've already ended the show?
Well, we're just about to run the outro, Dean.
Well, I don't know where I got cut off. I apologize. I look forward to seeing you, both of you at the International Conference on Men's Issues in Detroit. And all I was about to do is say, did either of you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, we've just done that.
You've just done that. Well, thank you so much for the Honorable Senator Ann Cools for joining us. We will see you hopefully in Toronto and also in Detroit. James, if you could take us home, please.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.
Bye.
You have been listening to Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and me, her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music and closing music is known as Sunshine and Eternal Hope, respectively, and is by Kevin MacLeod and used under Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also want to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and all of those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, if you're a victim of domestic violence, no matter if you're a man or a woman, gay or straight, adult or child, no matter what your race, your ethnicity, your religious views, your sexual orientation, or anything else, what you went through or are going through now is not okay. You should not be afraid to talk about it with people who understand and care. Just remember to talk to people who do understand and not to ideologues who fear the truth or will marginalize you and your experiences. Remember, the truth about domestic abuse is often painful to hear, especially to ideologues, and especially to those who've been through it and been marginalized and ignored. But remember, in truth, there is hope and healing, and we hope you'll be a part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time on Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and yours truly, Dean Esme. God bless.